Medieval weddings were far more than romantic ceremonies or glittering pageantry. They were binding contracts, tangled webs of alliances, moments of celebration, and often spectacles of chaos, superstition, noise, and negotiation. To truly understand what a medieval wedding was like, we must slip back into a world where marriage was rarely about love, where families measured unions in cattle, acres, and political advantage, and where the very meaning of "I do," or its Latin or Old English equivalent, could decide the fate of entire villages. Imagine stepping into a world where feasts lasted for days, where the bride might wear blue instead of white, where the groom sometimes met his bride for the first time minutes before the ceremony, and where the local priest might be forced to officiate in a muddy barn because the church was too crowded with guests already drunk on ale. In this story, woven as a long journey through medieval customs, emotions, conflicts, expectations, and celebrations, you will experience a medieval wedding as if you were standing at its very center. Imagine a small medieval village surrounded by rolling farmlands, thick forests, and crooked wooden cottages that lean toward each other as though whispering gossip. In this village lived a young woman named Elswith, the daughter of a well-respected farmer. Elswith had hair the color of chestnut bark and an expression that suggested quiet intelligence. She spent her days tending sheep, preparing meals, learning herbal remedies, and helping her mother maintain the household. Families chose spouses based on land, alliances, livestock, or debts. A wedding was a tool, not a dream. Her future husband, a young man named Aldrich, lived in a neighboring manor village. Aldrich was the son of a minor landholder, respected for his fairness and known for his skill in caring for oxen and managing grain storage. He had seen Elswith only once before, during a midsummer festival, but his parents had spoken with her parents many times. For months, the two families negotiated details of the marriage. How much land would the couple receive? Who would own the livestock? What the dowry would include, and how disputes would be handled. A medieval marriage contract could be as binding and complex as a legal treaty. Marriage, after all, affected property, succession, labor, and social bonds. Once the negotiations were settled, the wedding could be arranged. Medieval weddings did not require elaborate invitations. Word of mouth traveled quickly. The priest in the local village was informed, the church prepared, and the banns were to be announced. This ensured that anyone who knew a reason the marriage should not proceed, such as a pre-existing betrothal, consanguinity, or hidden scandal, could object. As the banns were read aloud from the church pulpit, villagers nodded in approval. A marriage between two hard-working farming families would strengthen the local economy and bind the communities even tighter. For common villagers, marriages were less about aristocratic calculation and more about survival. A good marriage meant strong children who would help in the fields, well-managed households, and the stability of two families supporting each other through famine and fortune. Once the banns were completed, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Unlike modern weddings, medieval weddings were not carefully choreographed events. They were sprawling mixtures of tradition, feasting, religious ritual, music, dancing, and sometimes drunken brawls. The entire village often took part. Neighbors contributed food, cheese wheels, loaves of barley bread, smoked fish, honey, vegetables, and ale. Local musicians practiced their melodies on fiddles, flutes, drums, and bagpipes. Women gathered linen to stitch special garments for the bride and groom. The wealthier the family, the more extravagant the preparations, though even poor families tried to make the wedding memorable. Instead, she wore a deep blue gown, the color of loyalty, dyed with woad. Blue was expensive to produce, and wearing it signaled respectability and virtue. She wore her hair loose, flowing down her back, something only unmarried women did. A wreath of herbs, flowers, and ribbons crowned her head. Many herbs were chosen not only for their beauty but for their meanings: rosemary for remembrance, sage for wisdom, and lavender for purity. Some flowers were chosen as charms against evil spirits, for superstition wove itself through every medieval custom. Aldrich wore his best tunic, dyed in earthy brown, with embroidered edges sewn by his sisters. Over his shoulders he wore a woolen cloak, clasped with a small bronze brooch, his only piece of ornamentation. Groom and bride alike carried charms and tokens to ward off ill fortune during the wedding, for the medieval world was a place where spirits, omens, and demons were believed to roam freely, especially during major life events. The day of the wedding dawned cool and bright. The air was crisp, the sky a wide expanse of pale blue. Villagers emerged early to set up tables and lay out food. The church bell tolled across the landscape, summoning guests from nearby farms, cottages, and manor houses. A medieval wedding often took place outdoors or partially outside the church itself. In fact, the marriage ceremony known as the betrothal or handfasting was often conducted just outside the church doors, where witnesses could gather. Only after the vows were exchanged would the couple enter the church to receive blessings. As Elswith stepped out of her home, walking toward the village church accompanied by her family, the gathered villagers murmured with admiration. They watched as she approached Aldrich, who waited near the church porch. With him stood 2 witnesses from each family, for a marriage required witnesses to be valid. The handfasting ceremony began. Aldrich and Elswith extended their right hands, placing them together. Father Roderick wrapped them with a strip of cloth, often a simple cord or ribbon, symbolizing unity. He recited in Latin, though occasionally he paused to explain in the local tongue for the gathered villagers. Medieval marriage vows varied by region, but they were simple, focusing on mutual promises of loyalty, support, and lawful union. During the vows, Aldrich promised to protect, provide for, and honor Elswith. Elswith promised to respect, support, and work alongside Aldrich. Love was not absent from medieval marriages, but it was considered something that often developed after the union, not necessarily before. Many couples learned affection and companionship through shared labor, raising children and surviving life's challenges together. Once the vows were spoken and accepted, the priest declared them married. A cheer rose from the crowd. Coins were thrown into the air, an ancient custom symbolizing prosperity. Aldrich and Elswith entered the church for a brief prayer and blessing. The church interior, dimly lit by candles and filled with the scent of incense, created a sense of solemnity. The priest blessed the union, sprinkling holy water and invoking divine protection over their life together. As they stepped back outside, the real celebration began. Medieval weddings were exuberant, noisy affairs. Musicians struck up lively tunes as villagers lifted mugs of ale, cheering. Tables groaned under the weight of food, barley pies, spiced stews, roasted meats, baskets of apples, loaves of bread, honey cakes, and flagons of ale. Feasting was essential, for it symbolized abundance and communal joy. In many villages, weddings were practically communal feasts, where even the poorest found themselves fed well. The first course was simple bread and cheese. Then came fish, often salted or smoked. After that, roasted meats such as chicken, mutton, or pork were presented. Wealthier families might have venison. Spices like pepper, cardamom, cloves, and cinnamon were expensive, but when available, used generously to impress guests. Dancing soon began. The music was rhythmic and lively, encouraging even the shyest villagers to join. Dances were performed in circles or lines with hands clasped, feet stepping in patterns learned over generations. Laughter filled the air as children chased each other between the tables. Dogs lingered beneath benches hoping for scraps, and elderly villagers recounted stories of weddings from decades past. Yet medieval weddings were not merely feasts and dances. They were full of rituals, games, and traditions that varied by region but shared a sense of boisterous joy. One such custom was the bedding ceremony. In some villages, the newlywed couple was escorted to their bedchamber by friends and family amid laughter, teasing, and noisy celebration. In other places, this practice was more symbolic and less intrusive, but it always marked the official beginning of married life. As the day progressed, ale flowed more freely. Jugs were refilled again and again. Some guests drank more than they should, leading to accidents, arguments, and occasionally full-blown brawls. Medieval weddings were notorious for rowdiness. It was not uncommon for rival families to settle old grudges during celebrations, or for drunken guests to insult one another. In such cases, the local constable or even the groom's relatives intervened. Through the whirl of festivities, Aldrich and Elswith found moments to speak quietly with each other. They talked about their new home, shared expectations, and shy hopes. Though they barely knew one another, something warm began to form between them, a spark of partnership. As night fell, torches and lanterns illuminated the village square. The feasting resumed with new dishes: berry tarts, sweet puddings, and spiced wine. Minstrels recited ballads of legendary love stories, knights, and heroic marriages. Some songs were humorous, teasing newlyweds with exaggerated tales of married life. Others were slow and haunting, filled with ancient melodies. One elderly villager, known for his wisdom, approached Aldrich and offered a wooden carving of two interlocked rings. He explained that the carving represented unity, endurance, and the circle of life. Aldrich accepted the gift with gratitude, promising to keep it in their new home. Elswith received a linen veil from the village women, symbolizing future motherhood and domestic stability. In medieval villages, gifts were rarely extravagant. Instead, they were practical pots, tools, blankets, animals, or food. Marriage was not only a social bond but also a merging of households. Economic survival depended on cooperation and shared labor. As the night grew darker, guests became more animated. A group of young men lifted Aldrich onto their shoulders, cheering loudly. They ran around the square, singing and celebrating the groom's entry into married life. Meanwhile, women surrounded Elswith, teasing her and offering playful advice on how to manage her new household. Laughter echoed across the fields. A strange mixture of superstition and tradition also accompanied medieval weddings. At one point, a group of villagers approached Aldrich and Elswith with a bundle of herbs tied in twine. They were instructed to walk around it 3 times to ward off evil spirits. Another custom involved breaking bread over the bride's head to ensure fertility and abundance. Elswith endured this with good humor as crumbs fell into her hair, and villagers cheered. Throughout the night, the fire in the central square burned brightly. Guests roasted meats over the flames, played games, recited stories, and celebrated the new union. Weddings were often the most joyous events in a village's year, lasting long into the night, or even multiple days if the family had the resources. But a medieval wedding was not only a celebration, it marked a transformation. Elswith would move into Aldrich's home, joining his family. Her life would change: new household responsibilities, new fields to tend, new kin to serve. For Aldrich, marriage meant stepping into greater responsibility as a husband, provider, and future father. As the night wore on, the newlyweds were at last escorted to their home. Friends and relatives surrounded them with torches, singing and laughing. Some carried baskets of food, ensuring the couple's new household began with abundance. Others brought charms for good luck: iron nails, sprigs of rosemary, small carvings, and ribbons. At the threshold of their home, Aldrich lifted Elswith gently, carrying her across the entrance. This custom, though not universal, symbolized protection and the avoidance of ill omens. Inside, their marriage bed had been adorned with fresh linens and herbs believed to promote fertility and protection. The villagers remained outside, celebrating until dawn. The newlyweds shared their first meal together: simple bread and honey symbolizing sweetness in their new life. They spoke in soft voices about their hopes and fears, discovering common ground. Outside, the sounds of the festival drifted through the walls, mingling with crackling lanterns. In the days that followed, the wedding celebration continued with smaller gatherings. Families exchanged gifts, helped with chores, and offered blessings. The new couple received advice from elders, shared meals with relatives, and slowly settled into their new rhythm of life. Marriage in medieval times was not a single event, but a transition woven into daily existence. As the seasons turned, Aldrich and Elswith grew close. Their shared labor: planting, harvesting, tending animals fostered companionship. They learned each other's strengths, quirks, and habits. Their marriage became what many medieval marriages became: a partnership forged through necessity, strengthened by mutual respect, and deepened by the challenges of daily life. Medieval weddings, in all their noise, color, and chaos, were a reflection of the world itself: hard, joyful, unpredictable, communal, and deeply rooted in tradition. They were not about perfection or extravagance. They were about forging connection in a world where survival depended on unity. Through feasts, rituals, vows, and celebration, medieval weddings bound families, villages, and generations together. And so, as we return from this journey into the medieval world, we carry with us a vivid picture of what weddings once were: a tapestry of tradition, noise, joy, superstition, and community woven tightly around the lives of people who found love not in lavish ceremonies, but in shared life itself. In the weeks following the wedding, Aldrich and Ellsworth began to settle into their shared life, discovering the small rhythms that would shape their future. It was midsummer, and the fields were lush with grain that danced whenever the wind sighed across the land. The village buzzed with activity, as livestock needed tending, tools needed mending, and roof thatch required replacing before the autumn rains arrived. Medieval life allowed little time for idleness, even for newlyweds. Ellsworth rose before dawn each day, as she always had, but now the tasks she performed were part of a new household. She swept ashes from the hearth, rekindled the morning fire, prepared porridge sweetened with the last of the honeycomb, and walked out to the small garden to inspect the herbs. Her mother had taught her the importance of rosemary, mint, and fennel, herbs that healed illness, protected against spirits, and flavored the simplest meals. She carried these teachings into her new home. Aldrich, meanwhile, managed the fields and animals alongside his father and brothers. Yet now he found himself glancing more often toward the cottage door, wondering how Ellsworth was adjusting, hoping she was not overwhelmed. Marriage, to him, had always seemed a distant concept, something that happened to adults far older, but now he stood in the midst of it, surprised to discover how deeply he cared for her comfort and happiness. Their home was humble but strong. The walls were wattle and daub, the roof thatched with layered reeds, and the single-room interior filled with the earthy scents of wood smoke and dried herbs. Medieval couples often lived with extended family, and Aldrich's household was no exception. Ellsworth now shared her days with Aldrich's mother, brothers, and younger sister. Privacy was rare, but community was constant. Though she had prepared for this life, adjusting was not easy. She missed her mother's voice in the mornings, the familiar crackle of the hearth she had tended since childhood, and the comforting routines of her old home. Yet she found warmth in her new family as well, especially in Aldrich's mother, a steady, strong woman named Lefren. Lefren guided her gently but firmly, teaching her the family's traditions, the way Aldrich liked his bread baked, how the livestock signal illness long before symptoms show, and how to mend woolen garments so perfectly the stitches disappeared. Little by little, Ellsworth's nervousness gave way to confidence. Every evening, when the day's labor was finished, and the sun dipped low behind the trees, Aldrich and Ellsworth sat outside their cottage, sharing quiet moments. They spoke of their childhoods, the stories their parents had told them, and the dreams they wished to shape into reality. These moments became the soft foundation upon which their marriage grew. Yet medieval married life was not without challenges. Autumn approached swiftly, bringing its own demands. Villagers worked tirelessly to gather the harvest before storms threatened the fields. Aldrich and Ellsworth joined the community in the Great Harvest tradition, one of the busiest times of the year. Men cut the grain with sickles while women gathered the stalks, binding them into sheaves. Children chased away birds, dogs guarded the carts, and the entire village labored until the last light vanished each evening. Harvest time also brought feasts, songs, and rituals meant to honor the earth's bounty and seek protection for the coming winter. Ellsworth learned the songs sung by the women, rhythmic chants that echoed across the fields as they worked. She found joy in their melodies, something ancient that made her feel part of something larger than herself. Winter soon arrived, dusting the village with frost. Days shortened and nights grew long and cold. Life slowed, but duties remained, tending the hearth, preserving food, repairing tools, and spinning wool. Medieval winters tested marriages as couples spent more time indoors together, sharing close quarters with family. In these months, Aldrich and Ellsworth discovered patience, humor, and deep companionship. They told stories by the fire-mended clothing side by side and learned the small details that made up each other's worlds. The way Aldrich tapped his foot when lost in thought, or how Ellsworth hummed softly when kneading dough. During the long winter nights, the village held small gatherings in the manor hall. Lord Halston, the local landholder, hosted these gatherings as a way of maintaining goodwill. Villagers brought food to share: stews, dried fruits, coarse bread, and jugs of ale. Musicians played soft tunes, and elders recounted tales of old. Among these stories were tales of legendary medieval weddings, some filled with romance, others with humor, and still others with tragedy. One such story was told by Aldrich the Elder, a man whose beard was long enough to brush the top of his belt, and whose memory stretched back to events no one else alive remembered. He spoke of a wedding that took place during a great storm, when the bride and groom had to cross a flooded river on horseback. Lightning split the sky, and the priest nearly lost his hat to the wind. Yet the couple insisted on marrying that very day. "Love," Eldrick said, "doesn't wait for the weather." The hall erupted in laughter, though beneath it many nodded knowingly. Another tale told of a noble wedding held in a distant kingdom, where the bride's gown was woven with gold threads and the feast lasted 7 full days. But even that magnificent display paled in comparison to the strength of ordinary marriages like Aldrich and Ellsworth's, built not on gold or grandeur, but on labor, patience, and companionship. As winter deepened, Aldrich fell ill with a fever that swept through the village. Medieval medicine was limited, but knowledge of herbs, rest, and prayer often made the difference between recovery and tragedy. Ellsworth tended to him faithfully, brewing herbal infusions of chamomile, thyme, and elderflower. She kept a damp cloth on his forehead, whispered soothing words, and prayed beside his bed. For days she barely slept, watching his breathing, listening for any sign of improvement. When Aldrich finally opened his eyes, weak but conscious, Ellsworth felt tears of relief spill down her cheeks. In that fragile moment, something profound settled between them, a bond deeper than simple vows and rituals. It was love born of care, fear, relief, and shared suffering, the kind of love that medieval marriages often developed not in the ceremony, but in the life that followed. Spring returned slowly, thawing the rivers and filling the fields with new life. With it came renewed energy in the village. Calves were born, fields were plowed, and seeds were planted. For Aldrich and Ellsworth, spring brought new beginnings as well. One morning, Ellsworth realized she was with child. News of the pregnancy spread quickly. Medieval villages cherished new life, for children meant future laborers, future heirs, and continuation of family lines. Women gathered around Ellsworth, offering advice and blessings. They gave her charms made of carved bone, braided ribbons, and small pouches filled with protective herbs. Midwives instructed her on diet, rest, and the signs to watch for as her belly grew. Aldrich received the news with joy and nervousness. He built a small wooden cradle with his own hands, carving simple patterns into the sides. He began to work even harder in the fields, determined to ensure his growing family would be provided for. As her pregnancy progressed, Ellsworth found herself reflecting often on her wedding day, the vows, the feast, the lively music, the laughter of villagers. She remembered walking toward Aldrich with uncertainty but also hope. She thought of the cloth binding their hands, the simple promises exchanged, and the warmth of his smile. The wedding had been only the beginning, but now, as she felt the first flutter of life within her, she understood how deeply those vows had transformed her life. Her thoughts often drifted to the meaning of medieval marriage, how it bound not only two people, but families, communities, and futures. A wedding was never merely an event. It was the first stitch in a garment woven over years, a garment that wrapped itself around homes, fields, traditions, and generations yet to be born. The months passed, and Ellsworth's belly grew round and full. She continued her daily tasks, though carefully and with help from Lefron and Aldrich's sister. The village prepared for the coming birth with gifts of blankets, wooden toys, and jars of preserved fruit. When the day of labor arrived, a storm raged outside, thunder shaking the sky, rain lashing against the roof. In the dim light of the cottage, the midwife arrived with her herbs and steady calm. Women gathered to support Ellsworth, while Aldrich waited anxiously outside, pacing through the rain. Hours passed, filled with pain, prayer, and determination until finally, as dawn broke, the cries of a healthy newborn filled the air. Ellsworth held her child, a son, against her chest, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers. She looked up at Aldrich as he entered, soaked from the rain, eyes wide with awe. He knelt beside her, gently touching their child's cheek. Tears glimmered in his eyes, reflecting the pale morning light. That moment, simple, tender, and raw, carried more meaning than the celebrations, the feasts, and even the wedding ceremony itself. It was the culmination of a journey that began with vows spoken outside a church, a journey shaped by seasons, sickness, labor, laughter, and love. Their son was named Godric, after Aldrich's grandfather. The village celebrated his birth with modest festivities, bread, ale, and warm stew shared among neighbors. Blessings were given, prayers spoken, and charms tied to the cradle's handle for protection. As years passed, Aldrich and Ellsworth welcomed more children. each one bringing joy and sometimes sorrow, for medieval childhood was fragile. Yet every moment, every harvest, every winter, every feast day, strengthened the bonds within their family. They raised their children to understand the land, the traditions of their ancestors, and the importance of community. And every year, on the anniversary of their wedding, Aldrich and Elswith shared a quiet moment together, remembering the noise, the laughter, the vows, and the flickering torchlight of that day. The wedding had been a grand beginning, but the true story, the true marriage, unfolded in the years that followed, woven through fields and hearthfires, through sickness and joy, through children's laughter and the passing of seasons. In the end, their marriage stood as a testament to what weddings truly meant in medieval times. Not just a single celebration, but the foundation of a life shared, a family built, and a future shaped by two people who began as strangers bound by duty, but grew into partners bound by love. As the years unfolded, the village around Aldrich and Elswith changed with the passing of each season. Though some things remained constant, the rhythm of the fields, the chiming of the church bell marking feast days, the laughter of children playing near the well, and the steady hum of life that threaded its way through every medieval community. Their son Godric grew quickly, learning to walk among chickens in the yard, giggling as he toppled into soft hay and clinging to Elswith's skirts as she worked. Soon he was followed by two daughters, Edwin and Mildred, and later another son, Bjorn. Each child brought new joys, new challenges, and a deeper sense of purpose to their household. But medieval life was never without hardship. One winter, a sickness spread through the village, a fever that took the old and the very young. Elswith's youngest daughter Mildred fell ill, her small body frail beneath blankets of wool. Elswith spent endless nights tending her, feeding her warm broths, placing cool cloths upon her brow, whispering prayers into the darkness. Aldrich gathered herbs from the woods despite the biting cold, determined to ease his daughter's suffering. For weeks they feared they would lose her, but slowly, miraculously, Mildred recovered. The experience left the family shaken but grateful, bound together by the shared terror of almost losing what was most precious. After the sickness passed, the village entered a period of rebuilding. Crops were planted with newfound hope, and neighbors helped one another mend fences and repair thatched roofs damaged by storms. Aldrich, now stronger and more experienced, became one of the most respected men in the village. He was patient, steady, and fair, qualities that did not go unnoticed by Lord Halston, the local landholder. One day, Lord Halston summoned Aldrich to the manor. The manor hall, with its timber beams and stone hearth, was grander than anything in the village, yet warm with the smell of roasted meat and burning oak. Halston praised Aldrich's reliability and offered him a new responsibility, the stewardship of a small parcel of land at the edge of the forest. The land needed care, trees to be managed, fields to be cleared, boundaries to be protected from wild animals. In exchange, Aldrich would receive a share of the harvest and the right to use the land for grazing. It was a significant honor and an opportunity that few villagers received. Elswith celebrated this advancement quietly, grateful for the stability it promised. She had grown deeply into her role as a wife and mother, but she was also known for her herbal knowledge, which surpassed that of many women in the region. People came to her daily for remedies, to ease childbirth pains, soothe fevers, or calm troubled sleep. Her garden had become a sanctuary of healing, filled with mint, feverfew, sage comfrey, and countless other plants she nurtured with devotion. Her reputation spread so far that even the manor's steward sought her help when his wife fell ill. Elswith's remedies saved the woman's life, and the steward praised her skill widely. Though medieval society offered limited opportunities for women to gain recognition, Elswith found her place in both her home and her community through her kindness and practical wisdom. As Godric grew older, he began to work alongside Aldrich in the fields. He learned to read the sky for signs of coming storms, how to mend fences, how to treat the oxen with respect. His hands hardened, his shoulders broadened, and he developed the same quiet determination as his father. By the time he reached 16, Godric could plow a field, build a thatched roof, and tend to livestock with confidence. It was around this time that Godric met Alfwin, the daughter of the village carpenter. She had fiery red hair and an even fiercer spirit. Godric first noticed her during a spring festival when she outperformed most of the boys in a competitive archery game. The arrow hit the target with an audible thud, earning cheers from the crowd. Godric admired her skill, but more than that, he admired her courage, the way she laughed unafraid, stood her ground and spoke her mind. Over the months, the two found reasons to speak, in the fields, by the well, during church gatherings. Their affection grew naturally, quietly, and for the first time in the family's history, love began to shape the possibility of marriage rather than simple arrangement. Medieval families valued practicality, but affection was not unwelcome when it came hand in hand with good character and strong labor. When Godric approached Aldric and Ellsworth to express his desire to marry Ælfwine, they exchanged glances filled with both pride and wistful recognition. They remembered their own youth, their own wedding, their own uncertain beginning. But now they looked upon their son, taller than Aldric had been at his age, stronger and wiser, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Negotiations began between families, as they always did. Dowries were discussed, modest, but fair. Agreements on land use, shared labor, and mutual obligations were spoken carefully. The church banns were announced, and soon preparations began for another medieval wedding, echoing the one Aldric and Ellsworth had shared decades earlier. But this time, the village itself felt different. The children who had once run around during Aldric and Ellsworth's wedding were now adults preparing their own feasts. Elders who had danced in the square were old now, watching from benches beneath the shade of oak trees. The world had changed, as worlds always do, but the heart of the community remained strong. As Godric's wedding day approached, the entire village joined together once again. Women baked bread, brewed ale, and cooked stews in large cauldrons. Men erected wooden tables, hung garlands of flowers, and set up torches for the celebration. Musicians rehearsed melodies that had been passed down for generations, lively tunes for dancing, solemn ones for the vow ceremony. The morning of the wedding dawned bright, sun rays glistening off morning dew. Godric stood outside the church, wearing a new cloak gifted by Aldric. His hair was tied back, and though he tried to appear composed, nervous energy flickered in his eyes. Ælfwine arrived shortly after, escorted by her family. She wore a dress of deep green, embroidered with simple patterns along the hem and sleeves. Her hair was braided with ribbons, as she wore a wreath of wildflowers much like the one Ellsworth had once worn. As Ellsworth watched Ælfwine approach, she felt a rush of memory, her own walk to the church, her own uncertain yet hopeful heart. She reached for Aldric's hand, squeezing it gently. He squeezed back, his eyes misty with pride. The ceremony was familiar yet fresh. Godric and Ælfwine's hands were bound with cloth. Vows were spoken in the presence of witnesses. Blessings were whispered in Latin and the local tongue. When the priest declared them husband and wife, cheers erupted as birds from the nearby trees, startled by the joyful noise. The feast that followed was one of the most vibrant the village had seen in years. Music filled the air as people danced until their feet ached. Children ran among wagons and fire pits, laughter echoing into the warm evening sky. Aldric and Ellsworth watched from the edge of the square, their hands woven together, hearts full. They saw themselves reflected in their son's joy, in the firelight, in the smiles of neighbors who had become family. As night fell, the newlyweds were escorted with torches to their new home, just as Aldric and Ellsworth once had been. Songs followed them, and blessings were whispered for a prosperous future. When the door closed behind Godric and Ælfwine, Aldric and Ellsworth stood quietly, feeling the weight of time settle softly around them. Their children were grown. Their lives had been shaped by the simplest yet most profound forces: love, labor, loss, and community. Their marriage, which began with a medieval wedding filled with uncertainty, had become a legacy woven through generations, yet their story did not end there. As the stars shimmered overhead, Aldric and Ellsworth walked home slowly. Their steps were steady, their breaths peaceful, and their hearts full of a love that had taken root in the soil of their shared life. A love that had grown as surely as the fields they tended, weathering storms, sickness, joy, and the endless turning of the seasons. They returned to their cottage, its old beams now holding decades of memories. As Ellsworth reached out to open the door, she paused and looked at Aldric, at the lines age had carved into his face, at the softness of his smile, at the trust his hand offered hers. Their wedding had been a single day, but their marriage had become a lifetime. And so the sun drifted steadily across the pale medieval sky, warming the village roofs and casting long beams of gold through the oak trees that surrounded the manor grounds. As the wedding morning wore on, the excitement in the air became almost tangible, like a soft vibration beneath every footstep, in every hushed whisper, in every shy glance exchanged among the guests who had begun gathering on the manor green. Word of a wedding always traveled far in medieval villages, through bakers who swapped stories with shepherds at dawn, through children who ran between cottages with unbelievable speed, and through merchants who seemed to know every secret before it was even spoken. By the time the sun reached its height, nearly everyone within walking distance had made their way toward the celebration. A faint sweet scent drifted over the manor grounds, a reminder of the preparations taking place behind oak doors and thick stone walls. It came from the kitchens, where great copper pots simmered steadily over roaring hearth fires. Thick stews of mutton and barley bubbled, while spits of pork turned slowly, dripping fat that hissed as it struck hot coals. Baskets overflowed with warm, crusty bread, braided loaves sprinkled with coarse grains, and little honey cakes shaped like flowers, an indulgence saved for special occasions. Even the poorest villagers could look forward to a wedding feast, for it was one of the rare times when food was shared freely, and the manor lord often made a point of feeding everyone who came. Inside the bridal chamber, the bride Ellen, with her quiet eyes and soft, gentle manner, sat before a polished copper mirror that distorted her reflection ever so slightly. She felt the tug of nimble fingers as her female relatives braided ribbons into her long hair, weaving in sprigs of rosemary for remembrance and tiny white blossoms for purity. Another relative whispered a blessing over her, wishing her a fruitful marriage, a peaceful household, and the strength to weather whatever storms life might bring. Ellen's mother hovered close, hands clasped tightly together, trying not to fuss but unable to contain the emotion swelling in her chest. Weddings were significant events for families, not merely a moment of joy but also a step toward security. A good match meant protection, pooled resources, stronger alliances between families, and hope for future generations. But for a mother, it was also a moment of letting go. Watching a child become someone else's partner, someone else's responsibility. She reached out and gently adjusted the bride's veil for the third time, even though it did not need adjusting. "You look beautiful, my heart," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ellen smiled, though her hands were cold. She knew her mother could sense her nervousness. A medieval wedding was not just an emotional union but a legally binding one, sealed by vows spoken before God and witnessed by the entire community. There was weight to it, an unspoken understanding that life would no longer be the same once she stepped out of this chamber. Just beyond the heavy wooden door, the corridor echoed faintly with the sound of men laughing. The groom Thomas was somewhere among them, likely being teased by his friends and brothers, who would be adjusting his belt, straightening his tunic, and reminding him half-jokingly not to faint during the vows. Weddings brought out such good-natured mischief, especially from young men eager to lighten the seriousness of the moment. Thomas himself stood near the window of his chamber, taking steady breaths. He had always been a calm, capable man, a miller's son known for his diligence and honest character. But today even he felt the enormity of the moment pressing upon him like the weight of a full-grain sack. His relatives had insisted on trimming his beard neatly and dressing him in a fine woolen tunic dyed deep green, the color of harvest and prosperity. Around his shoulders hung a cloak fastened with a bronze brooch, its engraved design depicting a sheaf of wheat. A younger cousin burst into the room with a wreath of flowers meant for him to wear. The wreath was woven from wild thyme and meadow blooms, symbolizing hope and steadfastness. Thomas accepted it gratefully, placing it atop his hair, though it slid slightly to one side, prompting laughter from everyone present. Outside, the manor courtyard buzzed with activity. Musicians tuned their instruments, simple fiddles, hand drums, wooden flutes, and a small harp carried by a traveling minstrel who had arrived just that morning in hopes of earning a few coins and a plate of food. A pair of village children practiced spinning in circles, pretending to dance with the adults later. Chickens strutted fearlessly between the legs of guests, believing they owned the world. A hunting dog slept lazily at the foot of a bench, utterly unconcerned by the chaos. As the hour of the ceremony approached, the parish priest emerged from the manor, his robes slightly creased from hurried dressing. He carried a small wooden cross and a book of prayers bound in worn leather, its pages softened from years of use. Though the church itself was only a short walk from the manor, the wedding would not be held inside. Most medieval weddings did not take place within the sanctuary. Instead, they were performed at the church door, where the priest could receive the couple and publicly witness their vows before leading them into the church for a blessing. So the crowd gradually shifted toward the stone entrance of the church, a modest but sturdy building with a thatched roof, whitewashed walls, and an archway carved with simple floral motifs. Ivy climbed its sides, swaying gently in the wind. The church bell rang a slow, solemn toll, calling everyone to gather. Inside the manor, Ellen rose to her feet. Her attendants straightened her veil and smoothed her dress, made of finely woven wool dyed a soft blue, the color of devotion and purity in medieval symbolism. Her shoes, simple leather slippers, peeked from beneath the hem. She took one last look around the room where she had spent so many years growing from child to woman. Then she stepped toward the door. When she emerged into the sunlight, the murmuring crowd fell briefly quiet. Heads turned, eyes softened, and smiles spread across familiar faces. 2 young boys walked before her, tossing petals gathered from the fields. Her father walked at her side, his arm linked with hers, guiding her toward the church door with slow, steady steps. Thomas waited there, standing tall though his heart pounded like a drum. When their eyes met, something eased within both of them, an unspoken understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. The priest lifted his hand, signaling the start of the ceremony. The crowd settled into a respectful hush. Birds chirped. The wind whispered through the trees. And in that quiet moment, the medieval world seemed to hold its breath. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice carrying through the crisp air, "we gather this day before God, and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." With every word that followed, every vow exchanged, every pledge of faithfulness, every invocation of divine blessing, the universe around them felt timeless, as though countless brides and grooms from centuries past stood invisibly beside them, sharing in the ancient ritual. The ceremony lasted only minutes, for medieval weddings were surprisingly brief in formal wording, yet each moment lingered with a tender gravity. When Thomas and Ellen joined hands, there was a soft cheer from the children. When they pledged themselves to one another, an elderly woman dabbed her eyes with her apron. And when the priest wrapped a narrow strip of cloth around their clasped hands, symbolizing their union in the eyes of God, a bright stream of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating them like a quiet blessing. At the end, the priest lifted his voice once more, announcing before all gathered, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." And the crowd erupted with applause, cheers, and joyful whistles. A few men clapped Thomas on the back. Women hurried to embrace Ellen, adjusting her veil once again even as she laughed breathlessly, but the wedding was far from over. For while the ceremony was sacred, the celebration that followed was earthly, raucous, and full of life. Villagers streamed toward the manor grounds, where the feast awaited. Long wooden tables had been arranged beneath the open sky, covered with linen that fluttered lightly in the breeze. Platters of roasted meats were carried out by sweating kitchen hands, followed closely by jugs of ale and wine. A group of musicians struck up a lively tune and children began dancing in a ring, their laughter rising above the music. Thomas and Ellen were guided to the place of honor at the high table, where a special loaf of bread baked in the shape of 2 interwoven circles lay before them. Guests approached one by one to congratulate them, offering wishes for prosperity, strength, and many healthy children. As the feast began, the couple shared their first meal as husband and wife. Traditional dishes appeared in abundance. Pottage thickened with herbs, chicken stewed with ginger and prunes, cheese wheels wrapped in waxy rind, bowls of sweet custard flavored faintly with saffron, and great trays of fruits, some dried and some freshly picked. There were even sugared almonds, a luxury that earned impressed murmurs from the crowd. As hunger faded into satisfaction, a new sound took over the celebration: stories. Medieval weddings were times for tales, epic ballads sung by the minstrel, humorous anecdotes shared by the groom's brothers, and wisdom-laden blessings spoken by the village elders. People laughed, shouted in appreciation, and clapped in rhythm. Even the shyest members of the community found themselves wrapped in the warmth of companionship. Soon the dancing began. A simple circle dance at first, with men and women joining hands, stepping rhythmically in time with the fiddle's tune. The bride and groom were coaxed to join, and though Ellen blushed beneath her veil, she allowed Thomas to take her hand. They moved clumsily at first, she stepping left when he stepped right, but soon they were spinning with the others, laughing with the wind in their hair. The dance grew faster, more spirited, until even the musicians began laughing between breaths. Guests clapped. Feet stomped dust into the air, skirts twirled, and the air filled with a kind of joyous chaos that only medieval celebrations could truly know. As the sun dipped low toward the horizon, the festivities took on a softer tone. Lanterns were lit, their glow painting warm circles of light across the grass. The minstrel played slower melodies, now ballads of old kings and forgotten battles, of love lost and found, of travelers who crossed lands no one present had ever seen. Couples drifted aside to speak privately. Children dozed against their parents' sides. The feast gradually turned into a gentle hum of contentment, like embers glowing in a dying fire. Thomas and Ellen walked together near the edge of the manor grounds, where the world felt still. Fireflies flickered near the hedges. The air smelled of earth and distant rain. "It feels like the whole world changed in a single day," Ellen whispered. Thomas took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Perhaps it has," he answered. "But whatever comes next, we will face it together." Behind them, their families and friends continued to celebrate, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding beneath the stars. And though medieval life was filled with hardships, harsh winters, long labors, uncertain harvests, there were nights like this that reminded everyone of the beauty woven through their world. Nights when a community united in love and celebration, when simple joys shone brighter than the grandest treasures. And so their wedding day drew to a close slowly, lovingly, with music fading into the cool night and the newly married couple stepping forward into a life that stretched beyond anything they could yet imagine. The firelight flickered. The laughter softened. The night grew deep and peaceful, holding the memory of the wedding within its quiet heart. As the night deepened and the stars brightened overhead, the wedding feast transitioned into a gentler rhythm, less lively than before, but warmer in its intimacy. Little knots of guests had gathered around lanterns or fire pits, speaking in soft voices, sharing memories, and telling stories they only ever seemed to remember on nights of great celebration. The elder men compared this wedding to others they had seen in their youth, arguing good-naturedly about who had thrown the best feast or which bride had worn the longest veil. The women spoke of their own wedding days, some joyful, some bittersweet, and some simply humorous, and they gave Ellen quiet smiles as she passed, knowing she now understood their stories in a way she never had before. Thomas and Ellen were often stopped by well-wishers, each guest eager to offer a small token of congratulations. Gifts were modest, yet heartfelt, woven ribbons to decorate the couple's new home, small carved wooden figures believed to bring luck, a woolen blanket brushed soft as down, a jar of honey to keep sweetness in the household, a tiny pouch of herbs meant to protect them from misfortune, and even a clay bowl a young child had shaped with clumsy, hopeful hands. Ellen accepted each gift with gratitude, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging so strong she felt it in her chest. The musicians continued to play, though more lazily now, as though the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of a well-fed belly made their fingers slower on the strings. One fiddler had loosened the ties on his tunic, sweat still shining on his forehead from hours of energetic playing earlier. The minstrel had settled on a stool, plucking gentle notes from his harp while singing an old romance, one so old that even the elders could not recall its full origin. His voice floated over the grounds like mist, delicate and dreamlike, telling of knights who wandered too far, maidens who waited faithfully, and stars that guided lovers home across darkened fields. When the final notes faded, the crowd sighed as if waking from a pleasant dream. In that moment of peaceful stillness, Ellen glanced up at the sky. The moon had risen high and full, bathing the manor grounds in pale silver. The stars shone with a clarity that made them look almost close enough to touch, as though they were watching the wedding just as intently as the villagers themselves. The breeze, soft and cool now, carried the scent of damp earth and distant pines, signaling that dawn, though many hours away, would indeed come eventually. But the night was not yet over. Within medieval custom, as the celebrations softened, a quiet tradition began, the sending off of the bride and groom. It was not a crude affair, nor one meant to embarrass, but rather a symbolic escort representing the blessing of the community as the couple stepped from their old lives into their new one. Older matrons gathered around Ellen, guiding her gently toward the manor door, whispering small blessings meant to protect her marriage and ease her worries. Meanwhile, Thomas's male relatives drew him aside, placing hands on his shoulders and offering advice that ranged from sincere to humorously practical. "Remember," one uncle said with a solemn nod, "a peaceful household begins with patience." Another leaned close and muttered, "But don't forget to keep your boots by the door. A man never knows when he'll need to fetch water before sunrise." Thomas chuckled despite himself, grateful for the laughter that eased the tightness he hadn't realized was still coiled within him. Inside the manor, candles had been placed along the hallways, their golden flames flickering softly like gentle guardians. Shadows rippled on the stone walls, moving with the slightest current of air. The bride's chamber had been transformed earlier in the day for this very moment. A small group of married women had come together to prepare it, smoothing fresh linen sheets over the bed, placing sprigs of fragrant herbs under the pillows, and lighting a single beeswax candle near the bedside, a symbol of warmth and blessing. Ellen stepped inside first, escorted by the women who had braided her hair that morning. They removed her veil with careful hands, smoothing her hair once more, and offering final advice whispered so softly she almost felt them more than she heard them. Words of comfort. Words of experience. Words meant to assure her that the fears she held were neither unusual nor shameful. When they stepped back, Ellen breathed slowly, feeling her heartbeat return to a gentle rhythm. She looked around the room, realizing that though it was familiar, it also felt transformed like a doorway into a different future. Then Thomas entered, guided by the elder man, who gave him firm pats on the back before leaving the couple alone. The door closed with a soft click, and the silence that followed was surprisingly tender calm, not awkward, wrapped in a kind of gentle uncertainty. Thomas stepped closer, offering a quiet smile. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Ellen nodded, returning the smile with one of her own. "I am," she whispered. And for the first time that day she truly meant it. In the stillness of their chamber, they sat side by side on the edge of the bed, speaking softly about the wedding, the guests, the feast, the dancing, and the overwhelming kindness of their families. They talked until the tension melted from their shoulders, and the weight of the day settled into a peaceful exhaustion. Their wedding night unfolded not as something dramatic or hurried, but as a slow, warm, reassuring bond forged through quiet conversation and a shared sense of stepping into life together. Outside their chamber, the villagers continued celebrating long into the night. Some fell asleep near the fire pits. Others made their way home under the moonlight, leaning on one another for support. Children were carried in the arms of their parents. Dogs followed families lazily, tails wagging in slow sweeps. The musicians played one last gentle tune before packing away their instruments. The manor servants, though weary, cleared the tables with soft hums, speaking about the beauty of the ceremony and the joy of the day. Lanterns flickered in the cool breeze, and one by one, they were extinguished until only a few glowed softly near the manor steps. As the village slipped into slumber, dawn slowly approached, unseen but inevitable. And when it arrived, it painted the world in hues of pink and gold, washing over the manor, the church, the rooftops, and the fields. Birds began to chirp again, announcing the start of a new day. A day that marked Thomas and Ellen's first morning as husband and wife. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered gently through the shutters, casting thin lines of gold across the wooden floor of the chamber. Thomas stirred first, blinking slowly as the warmth brushed his face. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the faint sounds of the manor awakening distant footsteps. A creak of the kitchen door, the muted clatter of pots being readied for the day's meals. These were familiar sounds, yet they felt somehow different now, softened by the weight of the new life he shared. Beside him, Ellen slept peacefully, her breathing calm, her hands loosely folded against her chest. The stillness of the morning wrapped around them like a cloak, gentle and unhurried. It was a moment both intimate and profoundly ordinary, the kind of quiet peace that medieval life often hid beneath its harder edges. Thomas watched her for a time, not wanting to disturb the serenity of the moment. When she finally stirred, her eyes opening slowly, she offered him a sleepy smile that held both contentment and shy warmth. "Good morning," she whispered. "Good morning," he murmured back. They took their time rising, not rushed by duties or expectations, just letting the soft light guide them into wakefulness. Outside, the village was already coming alive. Roosters crowed, hens scurried across courtyards, and the low hum of voices drifted into the air as neighbors began their morning routines. But this morning was different. For the newlyweds, tradition dictated that they were to be greeted not with chores but with blessings. When they finally stepped out of their chamber, hand in hand, they found the household waiting for them. The bride's mother approached first, carrying a small tray with bread dipped in honey. She offered them a bite each, symbolizing a sweet and prosperous marriage, and the gesture drew warm smiles from both families. Then came the well-wishers. Married women embraced Ellen, offering advice with a mixture of humor and sincerity. Older men clasped Thomas's hand firmly, patting his back with a kind of proud approval. Before long, the manor hall began to fill with villagers who had returned from the morning gift-giving custom. Medieval weddings were rarely a single-day event. Celebrations often spilled into several days of feasting, storytelling, singing, and community ritual. Today marked the second day, devoted to exchanging tokens that represented goodwill and the strengthening of bonds between families. Gifts were placed on a long trestle table. Most were simple, made by hand: a pair of embroidered cuffs, a hand-carved ladle, a clay pot shaped by a neighbor's daughter, a small loaf of bread shaped into a heart. The village potter presented a jug with a painted vine curling around its belly, explaining that it symbolized growth and unity. The blacksmith offered a small iron hook, practical, sturdy, and guaranteed to last a lifetime. Ellen's childhood friend brought a bundle of wool dyed with herbs, promising it would keep them warm through the coldest winter. Even the children had their offerings: little bouquets of wildflowers, pebbles they thought lucky, and strings of colored thread, tied carefully so as not to tangle. The newlyweds accepted everything with gratitude, their hearts swelling at the sheer generosity of their community. This was the essence of medieval life ties, woven not just by obligation but by shared survival, shared joy, and shared celebration. In a world where hardship was common, acts of kindness took on a deeper, almost sacred meaning. After the gift-giving, the second day's feast began, smaller than the wedding day abundance, but still hearty and full of warmth. Tables were set with leftover roast meats, fresh loaves of bread, bowls of steaming pottage, soft cheese, and apples sliced thin and sprinkled with a pinch of cinnamon. The ale flowed gently, not in raucous excess as the previous night, but in friendly moderation. People settled into comfortable groups. Some lingered indoors, while others spilled into the courtyard to enjoy the morning sun. Children raced around the perimeter, playing a game with sticks and a wooden ball. A pair of older women set up spinning wheels near the steps, their feet working the treadles in steady rhythm while they chatted about the changing seasons. At one corner of the courtyard, the minstrel who had decided to remain another day tuned his harp again, offering soft melodies that drifted into the air like feathers carried on the breeze. This morning he sang of new beginnings, using verses that had been passed down from minstrel to minstrel across generations. The tune was old enough that no one questioned its origin. It simply felt right, as though it belonged to every wedding that had ever been celebrated. Thomas and Ellen moved slowly through the gathering, stopping to speak with neighbors, sharing smiles with friends, and absorbing the warmth that surrounded them. Their hands remained intertwined for much of the morning. Ellen noticed small details she had never fully appreciated before. The way sunlight glistened on the dew that still clung to the grass. The soft murmur of bees drifting near the herb garden. The heavy scent of baking bread that seeped from the manor kitchens. Eventually, as the sun climbed higher, the couple wandered toward the orchard behind the manor. It was quieter there, shaded by trees whose branches hung low with early apples. A gentle wind stirred the leaves, creating a soft whisper overhead. This was a place often used by the household for rest, reflection, or quiet work, and today it felt like the perfect place for the newlyweds to simply breathe. They sat together beneath one of the older trees, its bark gnarled with age and its roots spreading like an anchor through the earth. For a long while, they said nothing at all, content just to listen to the natural world, to feel the breeze brush their skin, and to enjoy the comfort of each other's presence. At last, Ellen spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what our life will look like a few years from now?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Often," he admitted. "But I think, so long as we face the years together, I will count myself fortunate." Ellen smiled, leaning her head gently against his shoulder. The simplicity of his answer filled her with a quiet peace. They spent most of the morning there in the peaceful sanctuary of the orchard. When they returned to the manor, the guests had begun preparing for the afternoon's games, traditional contests held in honor of the newlyweds. There would be tug-of-war matches, foot races, and a playful mock battle with padded sticks for the younger men. Even the older members of the village participated, cheering loudly or offering humorous commentary on the competitors' techniques. Thomas found himself pulled into a race against several of the village lads, much to the amusement of the crowd. He didn't win, but he came close enough to earn good-natured teasing and hearty applause. Ellen watched from the sidelines, laughing as one of the younger boys tripped over his own feet, yet got up grinning as though he had won a crown. As the afternoon mellowed into evening, the festivities began to slow once more. Families departed with fond farewells, while others stayed to help clean and pack away the remnants of the celebration. The manor grounds gradually returned to quiet normalcy, though the scent of cooked meats and spilled ale still lingered faintly in the air. By the time dusk settled, only close family remained. The manor seemed softer now, hushed, gentle, warm. Thomas and Ellen sat near the hearth, where the fire crackled softly. They held hands and spoke about everything and nothing. The games, the feast, the kindness of neighbors, the brightness of the stars the night before. As the flames danced before them, Ellen realized something important, something she had not fully understood until this moment. A wedding was not merely a ceremony. It was not just a feast or a gathering or a night of dancing. It was a beginning that reached quietly into every corner of life, reshaping it not with sudden change but with steady, comforting presence. It was the feeling of no longer standing alone. The feeling of having someone to share each sunrise with. The feeling of waking every morning with a sense of purpose intertwined with another's. And with that realization came a deep, abiding peace. The fire crackled softly. The shadows deepened. And the night unfolded with the gentle certainty that the future, whatever it held, would be faced together. When the fire in the hearth had burned down to a soft bed of red gold embers, Thomas and Ellen rose from their places and made their way slowly toward the manor steps. Outside, the night air greeted them with a cool tenderness, carrying the scent of distant fields settling into darkness. The moon hung above them like a pale guardian, full and luminous. The same moon that had watched over countless newlyweds before them and would watch over countless more long after their time. The manor grounds were quiet now, peaceful in a way they hadn't been for days. The tables had been mostly cleared, and the last of the lanterns flickered softly, swaying with the faintest breath of wind. A few distant figures, relatives, lingering for final conversations, moved slowly across the courtyard, their silhouettes faded and gentle in the moonlight. Thomas and Ellen walked together toward the small path that led beyond the manor's walls. It was not a long walk, but enough to feel the crisp air fill their lungs. Along the path, the earth was cool beneath their feet. Wildflowers glowed pale in the moonlight, their colors muted, their petals closing for the night. The trees rustled softly overhead, whispering secrets that only the wind could carry. They said little as they walked. Silence, too, had become a companion to them, comforting and unhurried. When they reached the low stone wall that bordered the manor lands, they paused, resting their hands on the cool surface of the stones. Beyond it stretched the rolling fields where wheat and barley grew tall in the summer months. Now, in the gentler season, the land was covered in a soft quilt of low grass and heather. Ellen looked out over the quiet fields with a thoughtful expression. "It looks different at night," she murmured. Thomas nodded. "The world always seems bigger under the moon." They remained there a while, breathing in the stillness. It wasn't merely the peacefulness of the night, it was the feeling that time itself had slowed, giving them space to take in everything they had experienced over the past 2 days. Weddings were joyful, yes, but they were also overwhelming in their own way. To stand here, together, beneath the endless sky, felt like stepping into clarity. Eventually, they returned to the manor, where those few family members still awake greeted them with warm smiles and gentle goodnights. One by one, the manor's inhabitants retired to their chambers, until only the quiet creak of settling beams and the distant hoot of an owl remained. By the next morning, the world had returned almost fully to its everyday rhythm. The third day after the wedding was far calmer than the first two, though it still held a special air of celebration. Traditionally, this was the day when the newlyweds would visit the homes of neighbors to receive blessings and small gifts in return for sharing their joy. So after a modest breakfast and a few final preparations, Thomas and Ellen set out into the village. The village paths were familiar to both of them. Ellen had walked them nearly every morning since childhood, and Thomas, since moving closer to the manor, had come to know every twist and curve of the road. Yet today, those paths felt new, as if walking them together created an entirely different world beneath their feet. The first stop was the home of Ellen's childhood nurse, a kindly woman named Beatrice who had grown gray in the service of many families. Her cottage smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke, and she embraced Ellen so tightly the younger woman nearly lost her breath. She pressed a soft woolen shawl into Ellen's hands, crafted with careful stitches, each one worked slowly by candlelight. "For warmth," Beatrice said, her eyes shining. "For the winters ahead and for the quiet evenings by the fire." Ellen was touched beyond words, and the visit left her heart full. Next, they stopped at the home of the village potter, whose workshop sat beside the riverbank. The potter gifted them 2 matching cups glazed with a soft cream color, the surfaces smooth and cool to the touch. "For sharing," he told them, "because every household needs something crafted with love." Thomas and Ellen thanked him, watching as he returned to shaping clay with the steady rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime crafting beauty from the simplest earth. They visited cottage after cottage, greeted by warm smiles and heartfelt blessings. Farmers offered small sacks of grain, weavers gave them ribbons dyed with herbs, fishermen handed them dried fish for their larder, and children offered small treasures, pebbles polished smooth by the river, feathers they found beautiful, or flowers picked with earnest care. Every home carried the same spirit: simple, genuine kindness. At the far end of the village, the couple reached the home of an elderly couple known for their long, peaceful marriage. The old man, bent with age but bright of eye, welcomed them with a slow nod. His wife, equally weathered yet gentle, clasped their hands with surprising strength. "Marriage," she said softly, "is not measured in grand moments, but in the days you share. The quiet mornings, the long evenings, the laughter you bring each other, and the patience you learn even when the world feels heavy." Her words lingered with them long after they left. By the time the sun had risen past its highest point, Thomas and Ellen had visited every home. They made their way back to the manor with their arms full of gifts and their spirits full of warmth. When they returned, the household was already busy with the everyday tasks that life demanded: tending livestock, mending tools, sorting root vegetables in the storage room. Yet even amid this normalcy, everyone greeted them with affectionate smiles, as though the glow of the wedding had not yet dimmed. That evening, after the day's work was done, the Manor family gathered in the main hall for one last shared meal to conclude the wedding celebrations. The meal was simpler than the grand feast of the first night, but no less heartfelt. There was a stew of vegetables and herbs, slices of cold meat from the wedding feast, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, and a few sweet pastries saved for this final gathering. Candles lit the long table with soft golden flames that danced in the gentle air. Ellen's father raised his cup in a final toast, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "To my daughter and to Thomas," he said, "may their days be long, their troubles few, and their love always deeper than whatever storms they weather." Everyone lifted their cups, and the hall echoed with warm agreement. When the meal ended and the final candle burned low, Thomas and Ellen found themselves once more outside beneath the sky. They walked slowly across the quiet manor grounds, pausing occasionally to listen to the distant sounds of the settlement settling into sleep. The celebrations had ended. The days of festivity had passed. But what lay ahead was something gentler and far more enduring, a life built slowly, day by day. A life filled with shared work, shared joy, shared sorrow, shared hope. A life woven together as carefully as the ribbons braided into Ellen's hair on the morning of their wedding. Thomas took her hand, their fingers intertwining with ease. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "life returns to its usual pace." Ellen nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "But I think it will feel different now." They stood together beneath the stars, knowing that the days ahead would be full of challenges and uncertainties, but also love, companionship, laughter, and a bond strengthened by every sunrise and every shared moment. In the quiet night, with the world at rest around them, they stepped forward not as groom and bride, but as partners, ready to build their life in the steady rhythm of medieval days. As the final rays of daylight slipped behind the rooftops and the first stars appeared like scattered grains of salt across the deepening sky, the wedding feast reached a new level of revelry. The minstrels had switched to livelier tunes. Pipes trilled, a drum thumped cheerfully, and the fiddle sought out a melody that made even the stiffest-backed nobles tap their boots under the tables. The servants moved like shadows, refilling cups, clearing trenchers, and bringing out a fresh wave of dishes: roasted nuts glazed with honey, bowls of cherries preserved in syrup, and spiced pear tarts steaming as though they just left the cook's hearth. In the center of this joyful chaos sat Edith and Rowan, still nearly inseparable, though each moment came with a new lesson or expectation thrust upon them. Rowan had begun to understand that being a husband in a medieval village wasn't merely a personal milestone. It was a duty, something his new family expected him to perform with the full seriousness of a man stepping into a lifelong contract. Edith, on the other hand, had watched her mother lean close and whisper instructions with the urgency of a general preparing her soldier for battle. Every few minutes, a new cousin or aunt would tug Edith's sleeve to offer some practical advice about housekeeping, childbirth, food storage, or how to maintain peace with a stubborn husband. At last, though, the food tapered off and the heavy platters were carried away. What replaced them was something more symbolic, known in some regions simply as the bedding ceremony. Rowan stiffened at the mention of it. Edith's cheeks glowed crimson. The entire village, it seemed, took interest in whether a marriage was properly and publicly sealed. Now, contrary to what people imagine today, the medieval bedding wasn't always scandalous. In most communities, it was more ceremonial than intrusive. A crowd would escort the newlyweds to their chamber, depositing them in a room decorated with newly washed linens, fresh herbs, and candles. They might sing bawdy songs, but many would then retreat, leaving only a few trusted relatives or attendants to linger long enough to see the couple beneath the blankets. And so it happened. Edith's friends surrounded her, laughing and teasing affectionately as they guided her upstairs. Rowan's companions did the same, though theirs included elbow nudges and confident declarations about the tasks that awaited him. The entire procession was meant to be a communal blessing, and a rather rowdy one. The room itself was small but warm. Low beams, a narrow window, and a bed piled with wool-stuffed mattresses and linen sheets scented faintly of dried lavender. A few candles flickered, filling the space with a soft golden glow. Rowan stood at the door, uncertain whether to feel honored or humiliated as the last of the villagers made a show of waving them inside, cheering like spectators at a tournament. But the moment the door shut behind them and the last cheerful shout faded into the hallway, everything quieted. Rowan felt a stillness settle over them, a sense of private reality that no tradition could intrude upon now. Edith let out a slow breath as if she had been holding it for hours. She reached for his hand, and he took it gently. "We made it through," she whispered with a relieved smile. He laughed quietly. "Through the feast? Through the teasing? Or through the entire village trying to shove us into the room?" She nudged him with her shoulder. "All of it." They sat together on the edge of the bed, listening to the distant echoes of the party still going strong downstairs. The bed creaked softly beneath them. Rowan glanced at her, noticing the way her braid had become loose, small strands falling against her cheeks. Edith noticed him noticing, and a shy laugh escaped her. "It's strange," she admitted. "I've known you all my life, but this feels new." "It does," he agreed. "But not unpleasantly so," she smiled again, softer this time. And for a while the world outside ceased to exist. Downstairs the feast continued well past midnight. Wedding celebrations could last for days in medieval times, especially in the countryside where work pauses were rare and people seized any excuse for festivity. The more ale consumed, the more stories flowed, some exaggerated, some ridiculous, some heartwarming. Rowan and Edith's families swapped tales about their childhood mischiefs, their small victories, and their embarrassing moments. Even villagers who rarely spoke to one another except during harvests or church gatherings found themselves trading jokes or sharing food platters as though the wedding had woven them all together. By the second day, the atmosphere shifted. While nobles held multi-day banquets filled with endless courses and entertainment, village weddings were often far more practical. The second day was dedicated to work-related customs. Gifts, for example, were rarely ornamental. Instead, Rowan and Edith received sacks of grain, drinking vessels, blankets, tools, a few chickens, and 3 loaves of bread that were each bigger than Rowan's head. But one of the most important rituals took place in the morning. The morning gift. According to tradition in many regions, a husband gave his wife a gift the morning after the wedding, something meaningful, something that symbolized security. Nobles might give land, jewelry, or even entire estates. Rowan, lacking such wealth, offered what he had carefully prepared months before. A carved wooden chest he had made himself filled with simple but precious items. Wool cloak he had purchased secretly the previous winter, a comb made from polished horn a length of fine, ribbon dyed from berries and a small silver coin he had saved for years. Edith's eyes softened as she opened the chest. She touched the cloak, letting her fingers glide over the soft fabric, and then looked up at him. "It's perfect," she said. "Truly," Rowan felt warmth spread through him. He hadn't been sure if it was enough, but seeing her face told him it was. The second day also brought communal chores disguised as celebration. Men helped Rowan repair a fence that had long been sagging, while women helped Edith prepare her new home by setting up storage jars, sweeping out corners, and arranging linens. Weddings were not just personal unions. They were community investments. A stronger household meant a stronger village. That evening, when the sun dipped low again, the feast resumed, smaller now, but still lively. There was dancing, though shoes thudded slower on the ground as tired legs protested. There were drinking games, though more cups ended up spilled than emptied. There were blessings from elders, some long-winded and some surprisingly poetic. And on the third morning, when the celebrations officially ended, Rowan and Edith found themselves standing in front of their modest cottage, the village now returning to its ordinary rhythm. Chickens clucked lazily, smoke curled from hearths, and the quiet after days of noise settled around them like a feathered blanket. Edith looked at Rowan and squeezed his hand. "So," she said with a small grin, "this is married life." He smiled. "Shall we see what it's like?" And together, they stepped inside into a life shaped by tradition, burdened by expectation, brightened by companionship, and made entirely their own. The days that followed were quieter, but not easier. Medieval life rarely paused for long, even for newlyweds. The village stirred each dawn with chores that could not wait: animals to feed, fires to light, water to haul, bread to knead. Rowan and Edith fell into these rhythms naturally, though now their work was shared rather than separate, intertwined in every motion. Edith took charge of the hearth. Medieval women were expected to maintain the home, and theirs, though small, demanded constant attention. The hearth fire had to be kept alive from morning until night, fed carefully so as not to consume too much precious wood. She swept the earthen floor, tended the cooking pots, and learned how to pace her day so meals were ready when Rowan returned from labor in the fields or in the Lord's service. Rowan, meanwhile, found himself working harder than ever. A married man was expected to provide, and marriage wasn't simply romantic, it was economic. A household with two heads was expected to produce more, contribute more, and maintain stability. He spent long hours in the fields, turning earth with a wooden plow, repairing irrigation channels, mending fences, or assisting with sheep when the shepherd needed extra hands. Despite the constant work, there was warmth in the shared purpose. Rowan would return at midday to find Edith kneeling near the hearth, stirring a pot of pottage that bubbled thickly with barley and vegetables. Sometimes she added bits of bacon or dried herbs given by neighbors as wedding gifts. "Welcome home," she would say, wiping her hands on her apron. Rowan would sit beside her, tasting the food and praising her efforts, even when the stew was bland or heavy with too much salt. She learned quickly, though, and by the end of the first month, her dishes attracted compliments from even the village women known to be impossible to please. Evenings were their quietest hours. After supper, they sat beneath the fading glow of the hearth's embers, Edith spinning wool into yarn while Rowan carved small wooden tools or repaired their belongings. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they sat in companionable silence. And sometimes Rowan would reach for her hand, tracing small circles with his thumb, marveling at the softness of her fingers despite the work they did. Life was hard, but it was theirs. One of the most fascinating customs emerged during these early months: the neighborly inspections. In some medieval communities, elders, especially older women, would drop by unannounced to ensure the young couple was managing their home properly. It wasn't considered rude. It was tradition. Edith learned quickly that if her mother or Rowan's aunts walked in, she must offer them a seat, serve a cup of ale or warm broth, and listen carefully to every piece of advice, no matter how obvious or repetitive. "Keep the linens in the chest where dampness cannot reach," one aunt would say. "Store grain high, away from mice," said another. "Keep peace with your husband," said a third, "and he will work twice as hard for you." Rowan, meanwhile, endured the men's version of the same thing, being lectured about plowing techniques, the importance of building winter stores early, how to maintain tools, and how to prevent thatch from molding on the cottage roof. It was intrusive by modern standards, but to the couple, it felt oddly comforting. The village was not merely watching them, it was supporting them. Seasons changed. Spring melted into summer, and their marriage settled like a stone into a riverbed, steady, shaped by the flow of daily tasks. Summer brought harvest preparations, and Rowan spent long, hot weeks scything wheat fields until his arms were sore to the bone. Edith joined the women who gathered and bundled the grain, her skirts brushing through tall stalks golden under the sun. By the time the first week of harvest was done, their home was filled with the sweet smell of drying herbs, stored grain, and bread baked to last. The village took pride in these preparations, for winter scarcity was a constant threat in medieval times. A failed harvest could plunge an entire community into hunger. Edith found that the wedding had opened new connections for her. Women who once spoke to her only briefly now invited her to gathering spinning, circles where wool whirled under nimble fingers, and communal baking days when ovens large enough to feed dozens burned hot from dawn until noon. She learned not only skills but social knowledge: who had quarreled with whom, who owed a debt, who was expecting a child, who was secretly courting someone despite their parents' disapproval. Rowan discovered similar bonds among the men. Over mugs of ale in the evenings, they shared stories, traded tools, taught one another new methods of planting or repairing equipment. Marriage had shifted his role entirely. He was not just a young man anymore. He was a household head, expected to lead, contribute, and be dependable. One evening, after a long day of threshing grain with flails, Rowan returned home to find Edith sitting outside their cottage, watching the sky turn a deep violet. "You look tired," she said gently as he approached. "And you look peaceful," he replied with a grin, sinking down beside her. "I finished early," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "The last batch of bread is cooling. And I saved you the heel of the loaf." He groaned happily. "My favorite." They sat there as twilight wrapped around them, the distant sounds of the village settling in for the night dogs barking, mothers calling children indoors, the faint clink of a blacksmith finishing his final task. Rowan leaned back on his hands, drinking in the cool air. "Do you ever think about what our wedding will be like 10 years from now?" he asked suddenly. She blinked, surprised. "You mean our anniversary?" "Aye," Edith smiled at the thought. "Hopefully quieter," Rowan laughed, remembering the feast's wild energy. "Quieter would be nice. And maybe," she added softly, "there will be more than just us in this home by then." He looked at her, understanding the unspoken words. Children were expected, encouraged, even. Medieval families often grew quickly, though life's uncertainties weighed heavily. Many couples hoped, prayed, and prepared long before tiny hands ever reached for theirs. Rowan reached for her hand again, threading his fingers through hers. "Whatever comes," he said, "we'll face it together." She rested her head against his shoulder, and the two of them watched the first stars appear, just as they had on their wedding night. Of all the customs Edith experienced during her first year of marriage, Michaelmas was the most memorable. It was a feast day celebrated at the end of September, marking both the agricultural cycle's turning point and the settling of debts for many. For Rowan and Edith, it was a chance to demonstrate the strength of their new household. Edith baked honeyed cakes dusted with spices gifted by a traveling merchant months earlier. Rowan slaughtered a young goose, a rare luxury, and roasted it slowly over their hearth, basting it with herbs until the entire cottage smelled rich and festive. The couple brought their dishes to the communal table set up in the green near the village as edge. As the feast unfolded, elders observed them with approving nods. Rowan shared stories of the harvest's success and the repairs he'd completed on their cottage roof. Edith spoke about the herbs she had dried for winter, her growing spinning skills, and the new recipes she had learned from the older women. People noticed. And in a medieval community, being noticed in a positive light meant safety, support, and standing. When the feast ended and villagers drifted home under lantern light, Rowan and Edith walked hand in hand, feeling the weight of approval behind them. "That went well," Rowan said. Edith nodded. "I think we're becoming part of the fabric of this village now. You always were. So were you. Not like this," she said thoughtfully, "before we were children. Now, we're something else." Rowan understood. Marriage had transformed them. Not just legally, not just socially, but personally. They were partners in every sense, bound by duty, affection, and the intricate customs of medieval life. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in heavy flakes, settling thickly on rooftops and turning the village into a quiet white world. Rowan spent long hours chopping firewood, hauling water through icy paths, and mending tools indoors when the cold became unbearable. Edith kept the hearth alive, cooking hearty stews and baking coarse loaves that filled their bellies with warmth. Nights were cold, but they had each other. And though their cottage was small, the closeness felt comforting rather than confining. One night, during a fierce storm that rattled the shutters and howled through the trees, Edith and Rowan sat wrapped in blankets, the fire crackling loudly beside them. "Do you ever think about our wedding?" she asked suddenly. He smiled. "Often. It feels like a lifetime ago." "In some ways," Rowan agreed. "But in others, it feels like yesterday." Edith leaned her head against him. "I worry sometimes," she admitted softly. "About the future, about what kind of world we're bringing children into. It's a hard life." Rowan wrapped an arm around her. "It is hard," he said, "but it's also full of people who care about us. Full of purpose. And full of small moments that make the difficulties worth it." She exhaled slowly, her breath warm against his neck. "You're right," she murmured. He laughed. "I like hearing you say that." She nudged him playfully. "Don't get used to it." Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire glowed, casting warm light over the tiny home where two lives shaped by tradition, joined through ceremony, strengthened by partnership, were building something lasting. And so, in the quiet of winter, surrounded by the rhythms of medieval life, Rowan and Edith continued their story, one of love, work, community, and the ancient, intricate customs that had first brought them together. Winter settled deeply over the village, wrapping every thatched roof in white and whispering across the frozen fields. Rowan and Edith learned quickly that surviving the cold season demanded coordination, patience, and the willingness to endure long stretches of darkness broken only by the hearth's flicker. Yet even in winter, time moved. Snow melted slowly, and by Candlemas, the first signs of awakening stirred beneath the earth. Spring crept back gently, and with it came the soft thrum of renewed hope. In the quiet mornings of early thaw, Edith noticed the world differently. The air smelled less sharp, birds returned, and she herself felt subtly changed, tired more easily, hungrier than usual, often dizzy at dawn. It was Rowan's mother who noticed first. One morning she stopped by with a basket of dried apples. Rowan had already left for the fields, leaving Edith to stoke the fire. "You're quieter than usual," his mother said, narrowing her eyes with experienced suspicion. "And pale. Are you unwell?" Edith hesitated, unsure. "I don't know." The older woman stepped closer, touched Edith's cheek, and smiled knowingly. "Child." "I think you do." Edith's breath caught. Her heart thudded. She nodded slowly, a smile creeping across her lips. Rowan's mother embraced her warmly. "He will be overjoyed." When Rowan returned that evening, tired and mud-splattered, Edith took his hands and whispered the news. For a moment, he simply stared, as if afraid he had misheard. Then his face lit like sunrise. "A child?" he echoed. "Truly?" She nodded. He pulled her into his arms with such gentle excitement she felt her heart race. And in that moment, the small cottage, the worn tools, the simple hearth, everything felt richer. Pregnancy in medieval times was never taken lightly. It was a blessing, but also a journey filled with worry, caution, and ritual. And which charms to keep near her bed for protection. Rowan became even more attentive, fetching water, repairing anything that could pose a danger, and ensuring she never carried anything heavier than a loaf of bread. As her belly grew, so did the village's excitement. Birth, much like marriage, belonged not just to the couple but to the entire community. Edith's spinning group made small swaddling cloths. Older women contributed wool for blankets. Rowan's friends helped reinforce the cottage walls and patch the roof before the next winter. The baby arrived in late summer, during a warm evening when the fields shimmered with ripening grain. Birthing women gathered to assist Edith. Rowan waited outside, pacing the yard with his hands clasped tightly, praying under his breath. After what felt like hours of suspended time, he heard a sharp cry, strong, insistent, alive. A moment later, Rowan's mother opened the door and nodded him inside. Edith lay exhausted but glowing, holding a small bundle wrapped in soft wool. Her eyes met his, full of light and relief. "A daughter," she whispered. Rowan knelt beside them, tears pricking his eyes. He touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling at how her fingers curled instinctively around his. "A daughter," he repeated, voice thick. They named her Eleanor. Life shifted again, and this time more profoundly than marriage had ever changed it. Medieval infants required constant care. Edith rarely slept more than a few hours at a stretch. Rowan worked harder than ever, determined to provide enough food, blankets, and security for his growing family. But the joys were countless. Eleanor's laugh filled the cottage like birdsong. Her small footprints in the dirt outside brought smiles from passing villagers. She grew, month by month, into a bright-eyed, curious child who toddled after her parents with endless fascination. Their wedding, once the most important event of their lives, became a memory woven into their new story, a foundation upon which everything else had been built. Years passed. Eleanor learned to spin wool from her mother. She learned to carve small pieces of wood from her father. She learned to walk the fields, greet neighbors, fetch water, gather herbs, and hum the same wedding songs that Rowan and Edith had once danced to. The couple attended weddings of younger villagers, now watching as mentors rather than participants. They offered blessings, advice, and laughter. They remembered their own feast, their own traditions, and the way their community had shaped them. Their love deepened not through grand gestures, but through shared burdens, mutual respect, and thousands of quiet evenings by the hearth. One crisp autumn day, many years after their own wedding feast, Rowan and Edith stood together beside the village green, watching preparations for yet another marriage. Bright banners fluttered, tables were set, musicians tuned their instruments. Eleanor, now grown into a young woman with her mother's eyes and her father's smile, approached them with a warm grin. "Biv asked if I can help prepare the bride's ribbons," she said. "I remember you telling me how important that was." Edith nodded. "Go on then." As Eleanor hurried off, Rowan slipped his hand into Edith's. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The days when it was just the two of us, newly wed?" She leaned against him. "Sometimes. But I wouldn't trade our life for anything," he smiled. "Nor would I." They watched as the villagers gathered, laughing and bustling about. "So much has changed," Edith murmured. Rowan shook his head. "And yet, some things never do." He gestured toward the center of the green, where the bride and groom were being blessed, surrounded by family, neighbors, and the same traditions Rowan and Edith had lived through. Love, partnership, community. The ancient customs that had shaped generations continued to weave lives together, just as they once had for the two of them. Edith squeezed his hand. "We had a good wedding," she said softly. "We had a good life," he replied. And as music rose and the feast began, Rowan and Edith stood side by side, older, wiser, grateful, watching the timeless cycle of medieval marriage unfold once again. In the end, their own story wasn't simply about what medieval weddings looked like. It was about what they built from one. A home, a family, a legacy woven into the village's memory, just as enduring as the customs that had begun it all. The end.